About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research and explaining some of their ideas and experiments and their results. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, in the fields of medicine and psychology, people usually talk about consciousness as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. But in the field of Noetics, we talk about consciousness as much more than that. It's the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's the profound human experiences that shape us, and ultimately, consciousness, we are discovering, is what connects us all. Now, so far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is, and we started with the early work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung with their ideas from the early 20th century, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness at all. It is, in fact, unconscious. And then, as those ideas were being practiced and used, Charles Tart developed the idea of various states of consciousness, which he defined. And then Julian Jaynes looked at how the right brain and the left brain work differently, and as they are integrated, we get a different experience of consciousness. We then looked at some of the field models of mind that were developed in those years by Kurt Lewin and others, and later by Rupert Sheldrake, trying to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel. Which brought up, of course, how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the works of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami. That brought us to the global brain or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo. The field of transpersonal psychology emerged in the 70s to apply some of these understandings in therapy and research, and it continues to evolve. Parallel to that, we have the work of biologists such as Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who have described how hormones generated in the brain act as molecules of emotion and can lead to a biology based on our belief, which led us to the idea of coherence, a state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are in alignment. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, experiments that demonstrate telepathic communication between two people, mind having an effect on matter, and the experience of remote viewing or clairvoyance. Then we talked about the different states of consciousness that we operate in that can affect our ability to experience some of these experiments. We explored frequencies and how we can move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and the heart using the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, the HeartMath Institute, and the water crystals experiments of Masaru Emoto, and more. That brought us then to looking at the healing process and the role that consciousness and energy flows play in the body's response to threats and distress, which we'll talk about more today. We looked at the structure and function of the brain, which is the bridge between mind and body, even though materialist and physicalist scientists still say the brain is the origin of consciousness. When we get to that understanding, that mind not being a function of the brain, we have to look at the fact that mind continues, even though the brain may not be functioning at all, when the brain and heart have flatlined and the person is declared dead. And we looked at some of the experiments that people have done demonstrating that this indeed happens. To explain those experiments, we looked again at Ervin Laszlo's global mind, which he calls the Akash, as in Akashic record, and at a physicist's remarkable discovery that the equations that describe a neural network as a system demonstrate the behaviors of quantum reality when the system is in balance, and of our classical physical reality when the system is far from equilibrium, causing him to suggest that, in fact, underlying the universe is a neural net. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on that little cloud up in the banner at the top of the screen, and on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and the books and the authors that I mention. So, based on all that understanding, this week it seems time to address the world that I touched on a couple months back, describing the healing process, and really begin to understand what is actually happening when one person facilitates a healing process in another. In that show, I referred to a book I wrote called The Science of Mental Healing, which explains the principles and methods used by the dozens of teachers and healers in the New Thought tradition over the past 175 years. At the back of that book, I explained how what they did worked based on the science at the time I wrote the book, which was 25 years ago. Based on what we've explored on this show, I can expand on what was in that book. Let's look at the process. A person has sensations of discomfort. They go to an authority figure who tells them that those sensations mean something, gives their condition a name, and usually gives them a plan for reversing the symptoms. The plan may or may not work, depending on a number of factors, most of which are not in that authority figure, the doctor or the practitioner's, awareness. Those factors include things like the patient's emotional state, their pattern of thinking, speaking, and acting, and their trust, or lack of it, in their body's ability to heal, just to name a few. Their plan is usually based on the use of one or more drugs that have been demonstrated to be effective at least 10% more often than a placebo. That is, when the drug is tested against a sugar pill or a saline solution, 30%-ish of the cases have their symptoms reduced or eliminated by the placebo. And when treated with the drug, 40% or more patients do. The person follows the plan to at least some degree, and if they trust the authority and their own body's ability to heal, experience a reduction or elimination of the discomfort they started with. So, as Norman Cousins pointed out in his book, The Placebo Effect, the person's trust and belief is primarily what is doing the job. The drug may or may not help. It is the person's trust and belief in the practitioner's plan, and their own body's ability to heal that causes the symptoms to disappear. That was the fundamental discovery made by an inventor in the 1830s. His name was Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. He was an experimenter who held several patents, and when his own illnesses were healed by processes that did not involve practitioners or medicines, he began studying and ultimately was responsible for 12,000 documented cases of people's symptoms being eliminated without drugs, many of whom were treated through a series of letters that they were encouraged to read daily for a period of weeks. One of his healed patients re-injured herself shortly after Quimby died, and having spent several weeks studying with him and several years lecturing on his methods, she went into retreat and eliminated her own symptoms. Then went on to write up her process, teach it, and found at first a school and then a church based on that process. The patient was known at that time as Mary Baker Patterson. After she divorced her husband, a dentist named Patterson, she went back to her previous name, Mary Baker Glover, and after one of her students asked her to marry him, she became the famous Mary Baker Eddy, founder of the Church of Christ Scientist. And her Christian Science has provided a powerful method that has made it possible for many more thousands to be relieved of their symptoms. But many of her students found it limited in ways that they were uncomfortable with. Among those was a woman named Emma Curtis Hopkins, who went on to found her own school and ultimately had 11,000 documented cases relieved of symptoms, all of whom were encouraged to teach the process they had learned from her in their own way, healing themselves and others using the fundamental principle that what we think, speak, act upon, and ultimately believe is the most important factor in our well-being. From those people, several new schools and ultimately churches were formed, now known as Unity, Centers for Spiritual Living, Divine Science, and Homes of Truth. Okay, so much for how New Thought got established through documented healings based on mental practices. How does it work? Well, based on what we've seen in the past several weeks, including some of the experimental evidence, we can say the following. A person experiences discomfort and realizes he or she is off balance in some way. The person goes to a practitioner who helps them remember what balance feels like and reminds them it's their normal state and they need never be off balance. The practitioner may then help them enter a state of consciousness in which they can shut down that normal structure thought loop in their brain and access their mind. Now, the mind, being part of the one mind common to all humanity, as Ralph Waldo Emerson called it, or the Akashic field, as Irvin Laszlo calls it, is not subject to our normal thought loops. But it is aware of all wisdom stored everywhere in that one mind, or that Akashic field. So the practitioner at the same time is entering the same state of consciousness, accessing his or her own mind, and in that access, in that space, in that all mind, there are no ideas of illness, pain, suffering, poverty, or discomfort of any sort. The practitioner may call that mind spirit, or divine mind, or the one mind, or the Christ mind, as ways to help them remember that way of being. The phrase actually acts as a stimulus to help them get there. Once they achieve that state of consciousness, accessing their own mind, they are accessing the all mind, and both are not affected by the normal thought loops, and both are aware that life can be lived without any discomfort at all. The practitioner has been trained to say words that help the patient, the person, be open to the possibility that there's something going on in the thought loops that are interfering with or blocking the sense of well-being that is and should be their norm. So the practitioner states that idea is not true and can no longer apply to this person, and states again the truth that well-being is our norm. The person who had felt discomfort typically relaxes into this state of consciousness and allows what the practitioner is claiming to become their own new thought. And usually after one treatment, but sometimes as many as 5 or 6, the symptoms are relieved. These ideas that the mind is not the same as our thoughts, and that we all share a field of consciousness, and the ideas that are true in the mind can override our normal thought loops and so direct what the brain is telling the body, and therefore what the body is experiencing, are fundamental to all healing processes. And they've been demonstrated in thousands of cases by New Thought practitioners, by people in Joe Dispenza's workshops, and by people practicing certain forms of yoga, guided imagery, and shamanic rituals. They're how Louise Hay helped hundreds of AIDS victims override their symptoms in the 1980s, which is what made her famous. Oprah heard about that. And these ideas are also how Louise Hay healed herself of a cancer, and I'll let her tell you about that.
I know from personal experience that disease can be healed if we are willing to change the way we think and believe and act. Now, I believe that all illness is self-created. Not that we say, I want to have this illness, but we actually do create a mental atmosphere where this dis-ease can grow and flourish. I heard a physician from New York say on television a few weeks ago that if the surgeon operates on a patient without doing something to help them change the cause of the disease, then all the doctors were doing was prolonging the life of the patient until they could create another disease. We all create our experiences by the thoughts we think and the words we speak. The universe totally supports us in every thought we choose to think and believe. Our subconscious mind accepts whatever we choose to believe. You can say it either way. They both mean that what I believe about myself and about life becomes true for me, and what you choose to think about yourself and about life becomes true for you. And we have unlimited choices about what we can think. Every cell responds to every single thought you think and every word you speak. Continuous modes of thinking and speaking produce body behaviors and postures and eases or dis-eases. The person who has a permanently scowling face did not produce that by having joyous, loving thoughts. Older people's faces show so clearly a lifetime of inner dialogue. You see, it is my belief that it is our birthright to be totally healthy and totally fulfilled in every area of our lives.
These ideas, expressed by Louise Hay, who is a science of mind practitioner, or was, and her little book that I'll talk about later became the basis for the Hay House Publishers, which became the publishers of folks like Deepak Chopra, Wayne Dyer, etc. These ideas are the essential practices in all New Thought schools and churches, and they work. As she says, I can personally attest to that, as can dozens of my own students over the years. We have thoughts that lead the body to show up with various forms of discomfort or dis-ease, and we can change those thoughts, and we can undo the belief systems that triggered those thoughts. And as we do, the body responds because it's getting a different set of signals from the brain. Well, that brings us to our book. And the book I want to share with you today is Louise Hay's marvelous catalog of conditions and associated thought patterns that she published as Heal Your Body. In my work with congregations, this book is like a little reference book that goes on our desk. We have it handy for people who come in with an issue around their back or around their left side or their right side or their kidney or their knee. And what she has provided is a way for us to actually get a sense of what is going on in the thought process that leads to that. The full title of the book is Heal Your Body, The Mental Causes for Physical Illness and the Metaphysical Way to Overcome Them. The author is Louise Hay, and it is published by Hay House, and of course available in many forms on almost every medium that you can ask for it. She says in the preface, "Little did I know when I first wrote the original version of Heal Your Body that today I would be writing a preface for the 67th edition. This little blue book has become an indispensable item to many. I've sold hundreds of thousands of copies, far beyond my vision in the early days. I need to tell you that Louise Hay had moved to California on a hunch, on an intuitive hunch, that there was work for her to do there. And she had put together, in her 3 years as a practitioner in a religious science church in New York, this book because she'd seen that people who came to her would say, I've got this kidney problem, and as she worked with them, she'd find this thought issue that they were dealing with, or this neck problem, or this knee problem. And so she began to just create this catalog, which she put in alphabetical order. And she printed up a little pamphlet, and she showed a draft to her minister, and her minister said, oh, very sweet, very nice. What are you going to do with it? And she said, well, I've made 3,000 copies. She sent them to everybody in that church and in every other church she can reach, and they took off. And as I said earlier, has made a huge difference in many people's lives. So she's added a whole bunch of things to the new version, and she says, in this newly revised edition, I want to share with you one of the reasons why I know that dis-ease can be reversed by simply reversing mental patterns. A number of years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer of the vagina. With my background in being raped when I was 5 years old and being a battered child, it was no wonder that I'd manifested cancer in the vaginal area. Having already been a teacher of healing for several years, I was very aware that I was now being given a chance to practice on myself and prove what I'd been teaching others. I knew that mental healing worked. Being aware that cancer comes from a pattern of deep resentment that is held for a long time until it literally eats away at the body, I knew I had a lot of mental work to do. I realized that if I had the operation to get rid of the cancer but did not clear the mental pattern that created it, then the doctors would just keep cutting Louise until there was no more Louise to cut. If I had the operation and cleared the mental pattern that was causing the cancer, then the cancer wouldn't return. When cancer or any other illness returns, I don't believe it's because the doctor didn't, quote, get it all out, unquote, but rather that the patient has made no mental changes and so just recreates the same illness. I also knew that if I could clear the mental pattern that created the condition called cancer, I wouldn't need the doctor. So I bargained for time. The doctor grudgingly gave me 3 months, at the same time warning me that my life was endangered by the delay. I immediately began to work with my own teacher to clear old patterns of resentment. Up to that time, I hadn't acknowledged that I harbored deep resentment. We're often so blind to our own patterns. A lot of forgiveness work was in order. The other thing I did was go to a good nutritionist and completely detoxify my body. So between the mental and physical cleansing, in 6 months, I was able to get the medical profession to agree what I already knew. I no longer had any form of cancer. So now, when I hear about someone's illness, no matter how dire their predicament seems to be, I know that if they're willing to do the mental work of releasing and forgiving, almost anything can be healed. The condition came from nothing and will go back to nothing. All right. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments on KXCR 90.7 on the FM dial and streaming on KXCR.net. And that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today. This week, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, an advisory group for the Department of Health and Human Services, issued a recommendation that all Americans under the age of 65 get screened for anxiety. Their purpose is to uncover hidden or underreported mental health disorders so they don't go untreated. Whatever the cause, the percentage of adults reporting recent symptoms of an anxiety or depressive disorder rose from about 36% to about 42% just between August of 2020 and February 2021. Now, they're recommending anxiety screening for people under 65 because the screening technique that they have makes it hard to tell whether you're anxious or just old. They're really concerned about teens and middle-aged men. The suicide rate among teens has skyrocketed over the last several years, and the acting out of middle-aged men in everything from the January 6th insurrection to shootings in various parts of the country are telling us that there is a fundamental disorder or imbalance, as I said earlier, in people's mental health. Anxiety can lead to all kinds of conditions, ranging from fatigue and pain to reinforced fear through that thought loops we were talking about earlier. Being in fear then leads to the construction of more things to be afraid of, and fear then also can lead to anger. So anxiety is a fundamental issue, and apparently is now the fundamental issue in American culture. So your doctor may give you a survey to take to help determine whether you are suffering from anxiety. And you may be seeing a psychologist or a social worker or a psychiatrist to diagnose you more thoroughly and then help you address the symptoms. The symptoms of anxiety are the same issue that we've been talking about on this show. The brain is not the mind. The brain gets caught up in thought loops and tells the body what to feel and what to do. What we need to do is experience not being in our thought loops. So do something that you love, that you get into the flow of. Be in places that are filled with beauty. Give yourself time in the silence and enjoy just being still, and then listen to music that helps you be happy and joyful. We are part of an infinite universe that is undergirded by this marvelous neural net, this consciousness, this Akashic field in which everything is connected, and we are encouraged to be whole and well, experiencing well-being as our birthright. Thanks so much. That's it for today's show. We're out of time for today. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there is a list of the shows and to the titles and other resources we refer to, and where you can send me your comments and questions. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.